Hi, this is Mr. Chandler. Today we're going to look at the building behind me, kinda. We're going to look at the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court is the third branch of the government. It's probably the one that was least talked about in the Constitution. And so today we're going to look at how the Supreme Court got its power. And it got its power through a court case, so they kind of gave themselves their power. We've been discussing the early Constitution and the early government in the United States, and we've been talking about Federalists and Democrat Republicans, and today is going to be similar to that as well. So we're going to look at that court case, Marbury versus Madison. We're going to talk about how the expansion of power of the national government through the Supreme Court decisions by John Marshall, who was a Federalist, led to a stronger national government. And then we're going to talk about the very, very important concept of judicial review, which you definitely need to know. And then we're going to talk about how his political party in particular impacted the Supreme Court by making this court stronger. This is probably going to be the shortest video to date, so you're in luck. The Constitution, since the Constitution, ideas about democracy have developed as a result of decisions of the Supreme Court. We have lots of important Supreme Court decisions that we're going to discuss in this class, like Brown versus Board, the Dred Scott decision, Plessy versus Ferguson, Roe versus Wade, just to name a few. The principles and ideas of the Constitution and the power of the national government were strengthened by the decisions of the Supreme Court under the leadership of John Marshall. That's an important phrase. See that bolded part right there? You're definitely going to need to know that in the future. John Marshall was a Federalist. Federalists believed in a strong national government. So John Marshall, in his decisions as a Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, increased the power of the national government because he was a Federalist. Decisions of Marshall Court supported a strong federal government that had power over the states and reflected the interests of the Federalist. He's a Federalist. Majority of the court at the time were Federalist, so they strengthened the national government. The first Congress established the court system through the Judiciary Act of 1789 because the Constitution didn't really go into much detail on the judiciary system. In fact, if you look at the article of the Constitution that set up the judiciary system, it's very small. It doesn't really lay out a lot. It's kind of vague. The very first Chief Justices presided over a very weak court. John Marshall was appointed by John Adams. John Adams was a Federalist, so he appointed a Federalist, John Marshall. And the Marshall Court is an example that presidential power is felt long after the appointing administration is gone. So for instance, if there's a vacancy on the Supreme Court right now, then President Obama gets to pick somebody, and that person will then serve for life. So even though President Obama only has a couple more years on his presidential term, his power is still going to be felt after that. And that's the way it was with the Marshall Court. The Senate has to confirm appointments to the judiciary. Presidents usually appoint justices who hold political ideas that are similar to their own. So for instance, like I said, if there's an opening right now, then President Obama will probably pick someone who believes very similar to him to serve as a justice. And then that person has to be approved by the Senate. John Marshall ended up serving for over 30 years because it's a lifetime appointment. And so during those 30 years, the decisions that were made by John Marshall and the rest of the court favored a strong government because he was a Federalist. And that's why John Adams picked him, because he was a Federalist and he believed in a strong national government. And that's been true throughout American history, and it's still true to this day. The ruling of the Marshall Court in Marbury versus Madison began the precedent of judicial review. So it set up the idea of judicial review as a vital part of the checks and balances system. What it means, what judicial review means, is that the Supreme Court can declare a law made by Congress or a presidential act unconstitutional. So they have the final say. So for instance, in Brown versus Board of Education, the Supreme Court said that segregation in schools was unconstitutional. So this power creates a very strong power for that branch of government, for the judicial branch. This is not a power given to the Supreme Court in the Constitution. They took it on their own through the interpretation of the Marbury versus Madison case. So that's a very important idea. You have to know judicial review. You have to know that judicial review allows the Supreme Court to declare laws unconstitutional and acts by president unconstitutional. The Marshall Court continued to strengthen the role of the federal government. Here are some different Supreme Court cases that were around during the John Marshall era. Every single one strengthened the federal government. So you can see Gibbons versus Ogden, the federal government could control interstate commerce. Dartmouth versus Woodard basically was talking about the sanctity of contracts. Basically that sanctity of contracts have to be upheld against the encroachment of state government. Federal government, McCulloch versus Maryland said the federal government can establish the national bank and states cannot tax that national bank. And then Worcester versus Georgia is a really interesting one, because what that's on is about the Native Americans, the Cherokees in particular, in Georgia. And it said that Georgia couldn't limit the rights of individuals in a case related to Indian reservations. So basically they couldn't take away the Indians' rights on those reservations, the Native Americans on those reservations. So that Cherokees are basically their own nation state on that reservation. And what's interesting at the time, Andrew Jackson's going to say, John Marshall made his decision, now let's see him enforce it. Because Andrew Jackson was the president at the time. So that shows the Supreme Court can say something's unconstitutional, but they don't really have a way to enforce it. Later, the court's going to begin to play a vital political role, such as the Dred Scott decision, Brown versus Board, and the Supreme Court is truly the most, or one of the most, becomes an equal branch, I should say, with the rest of the other two branches. So, to summarize, what you should really understand about this is how the Supreme Court got its power. It got the power of judicial review, which makes it a very strong branch of the government, equal to the other two. And what judicial review does is allow them to say that if a law or an act by the president is constitutional or not. And so John Marshall, as the Chief Justice, is really going to strengthen the federal government and strengthen the Supreme Court in general. And so that's kind of the most important thing, and you really need to know that. And so going forward, the Supreme Court will be an equal branch to the other two. Thank you very much for watching. Turn in your notes guide, and also make sure your name is on there and you have a question on there as well. And if you have any questions about this, feel free to ask. Feel free to send me a message on Canvas, whatever works. I'll be glad to help you out. So thank you very much for watching.